All right. Charles, boy, did you miss a good week last week. All right. Woo! Jesus is coming again. I'm still on. We're just making sure everybody's awake. I think DP's hacking the system from the beach. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, which Paul was tackling, again, the issue of prophecy in tongues and how the Corinthians were misusing them. The big issue in Corinth is that they were all battling over this gift of tongues. And so they're fighting for it, they're fighting over it. The order of worship was non-existent. And so in the latter part of chapter 14, this is what Paul's addressing. And so, we did talk about how verse 34 in particular has been kind of misrepresented probably to say that women need to be silent in the church and, they shouldn't talk, they shouldn't, I know churches that during worship, like when worship is in order, they don't let women even ask questions during class time because they're supposed to ask their husbands at home, And I just think it's such a wrong interpretation of that. And so I talked about the word silent that's used. And I actually underlined and circled some things here because this word is used, the same word is used both for speaking in tongues and when the prophets are speaking. So I circled tongue in verse 27. If you look, Paul says, if any speak in a tongue, let there be two or at most three. All right, so, and then if you go a little bit further down in verse 28, but if there's no one to interpret, let each of them keep silent. That's the first use of that word. And so I think clearly he's not saying everybody needs to not prophesy at all. Keep silent, don't talk. This is the Lord's worship. I think we're mistaken if that's the interpretation that we take. All right, so clearly he was encouraging people to prophesy, but to prophesy in order, to do it in a manner that didn't bring dishonor to the Lord or to the Lord's church. And to each other, that's right. Yeah.
All the interruptions, like I just did here.
Yeah, no. Silent. Great point. Yeah, the way that they talk to each other mattered. Okay, so those are the tongue speakers. I got ahead of myself. We're talking about the tongue speakers. If you don't have an interpreter, keep silent. And then I circled prophets in verse 29. 2 or 3 prophets. I circled that. And then going down to verse 30, if a revelation is made to another sitting there, let the first be silent. Right? Same word. And the use of that word, I mentioned in the English language, we have different words for silence. We have different expressions for keeping silent. Zip your lip is an expression that we have in English, which means what? Tone it down, right? And it's kind of the sense of this word stagao that Paul's using. It's a toning down, not an audible silence. And then in verse 34, I circled women. And then right after it, I underlined keep silent. It's the same exact word that's used for prophets and tongue speakers. Paul's using the same word for women. So does that mean that women, contextually, Paul's saying that women, we're going to use this a little bit differently for women than we apply it, to the prophets and tongue speakers. And so women are supposed to be silent no matter what. I think that's a stretch. I really do. That's not the point that Paul's making here. And we know, whether we like it or not, women were praying and prophesying in Corinth. And I'm not trying to take that and apply it to today and say, all right, cool, women should be up prophesying or whatever, that's not the point. The point is, what was Paul saying to the church in Corinth at that time? What was he addressing? He was addressing disorderly worship, people domineering over each other, whether it was women domineering over men, which was an issue, whether it was men praying and prophesying with their heads covered, which was an issue that was happening. I talked about Dr. Oster, who wrote many scholarly articles about when men wore veils in Corinth. In pagan Corinth, the men would routinely wear veils when they prophesied, and so Paul's coming back, and he does not like when the Christians look like the pagans in the way that they worship. Because what's it doing? It's bringing people back into this mindset of paganism. And it's likening Christianity to paganism, and Paul wants that separation. Don't look like the pagans in the way you act, in the way you worship, in the way you conduct yourselves, in any other part of culture. Just don't look like them. Because what that does is it brings other people back into paganism. It affects your weaker brother. So that's the point Charles made. Especially the issue is the way that you guys relate to each other. Can you keep order among yourselves? Because if you don't, and again, remember Paul makes this point, what do you think people are going to think when they walk in here and people are like falling on the floor and speaking in tongues and there's no interpreter and nobody has any idea what anybody's saying? It's a rhetorical question. They're going to think you're nuts, right? It's not helpful. It's not useful. So Paul's really concerned with the way the Christians conduct worship in an orderly manner. I think we talked about this expression, as in all the churches of the saints, in verse 33, or depending on which translation you have. Some put it in verse 34, I think. But at any rate, the ESV drops that down and creates a new paragraph, and it says, as in all the churches of the saints, comma, the women should keep silent in the churches. That's an interpretive move. I don't think that's right. I think that saying belongs, like I think the American Standard Version puts it up with the sentence in verse 33, for God is not a God of confusion, but of peace, comma, as in all the churches of the saints, period. I think the ASV gets that right. And you have to remember, when people interpret or translate scriptures, they're also interpreting too, because there are expressions like this. In the Greek language, it could marry itself to the expression below or above. And so context has to determine that. The problem is, we could take that either way, contextually, as you see the translators do. Some translators say, hey, God is not a God of disorder, but, he's not a God of confusion, rather, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. Other people say, as in all the churches of the saints, women should remain silent in the churches. That's a huge difference in how you interpret that section.
Well, what about the rest of the verse?
Which verse?
For they are not permitted to speak.
Yeah, for they are not permitted to speak. The question is that a temporal thing or is that a permanent for all time? And, again, that's an interpretive move. Contextually, it makes no sense to me because in chapter 11, Paul's addressing the issue of women praying and prophesying. He says, if you pray and prophesy, do it with your heads covered. Brent brought up a point too. The question is, when? Is that during corporate worship, or is that in some other context?
I was going to say, and I don't think we probably don't want to go down the rabbit hole of discussing all of the things related to this.
Right, yeah.
As far as worship goes, there's several different ways of using the term worship. worship is a very specific action. So we worship God in general, overall. But then there's, like you said, corporate worship, like the worship item. So
when people are gathered together.
Right. The purpose is to come together to worship God. And my take on that is always when you're coming together to worship God, you better be doing it the way He tells you to do it, because He's the one you're worshiping. So that's the question as you go through all of this. I think that's is every time the church is together, is that worship? In the term that we're using,
right?
Or is it? Or are there different times that the church gathers and there's different aspects of that? Like, so that's just kind of as you talk about that, that's kind of what I think through. Like, all right, well, what are we talking about here?
Yeah.
But then also, like the rest of verse 34, where it says, "They are not permitted to speak; should be submission as the law also says." So he's using the law as justification for when not being allowed to speak. This is. I don't know if I would want to say that this is like a directive from God or a directive from Paul.
I know, and sometimes it's hard to tell, unless Paul explicitly says, like, I, not the Lord, like in chapter 7. Yeah.
Well, we talked about last week that, I mean, it kind of seems like it's an order of creation thing to some degree, right? Some of this discussion as well.
Yeah.
Like how God has established things. I guess that's kind of what you're saying there.
So, yeah, I mean, and again, so this is not the weasel man's way out. It's just not the scope of me to address this, because then, like Brent said, we'd have to go over to 1 Timothy and talk about when Paul talks about women being silent there. Like, there are different passages that talk about the silence of women, not teaching, having authority over men. Well, what does that mean? You can take an extremely legalistic view on that, or you can say, what was the issue going on, and what are we talking about contextually, and is this a timeless thing that's commanded here, or is it a directive? Is it a suggestion? Is it? I mean, you can go down a lot of different rabbit trails for this. Well, I think there's not a question in Corinth. I think we would have to do some really fancy footwork to say that women were not praying and prophesying in Corinth. What's that? Right.
This is my opinion, and the law also says.
Yeah.
So he's not mincing words.
No. But again, I mean, for me, the issue was this issue of domineering, positioning somebody's self over somebody else that created massive disorder. I mean, that's the whole letter. That's the context of the letter. And so, yeah.
Another question I have is, okay, so he's trying to draw them away from the law because it's not Christ-centered. But then he at the end there, he actually refers to the law. So which is it that he wants them to follow? I mean,
Yeah, and that's not the only place by a long shot that Paul does that. So
why is he drawing them back into, well, the law says this too?
Yeah.
No, I don't want you to follow the law because that draws you away from.
I think what he's doing is he's showing people the fulfillment of the law, not the completion of the law, but the fulfillment of the law. And so Paul, all over the place appeals to the law. But then, sorry, go ahead.
Keeping in mind the law, we really messed this up bad.
Yeah.
The law was perfect and righteous.
Mm-hmm.
The law's purpose was not to condemn people, but to show them what holiness was.
Yes.
Violating holiness is what condemns someone.
Yes.
And the law could not solve that problem. But holiness is holiness. And we tend to get really confused on violating the law as opposed to being holy. And there is no alternation from the Old Testament in that we should be holy.
Yes.
So the Old Testament, as Paul will say, I'm not thinking Peter actually, all Scripture is good for teaching.
Yeah.
Okay?
Well, I think that's a great point, and along with what Brent said about worship, too. What does God say? I hate your worship. Right? Hosea 6:6. I hate your worship. Well, what's the rest of that? I desire mercy instead of you worshiping with an empty heart. You're worshiping, you're going through the motions, but God wants your holiness. He wants your heart. He wants you to be a righteous person. And I think contextually too, this is the issue at heart in Corinth. Paul's not making an argument, in my opinion. Paul's not making an argument pro or con women's roles in the church. That's not Paul's point here. Paul's not making the point whether women should, what are women's roles in the church? That's not the point. The point is, how do women conduct themselves when they worship? Is it orderly, or do they domineer and shut people down and talk over people, right? It's that relationship between your fellow brother and sister. What does that look like?
I think that's the point where he says, if you want to learn anything with the women, ask your husbands at home. It's not about they're not allowed to ask questions.
That's right.
It's about domineering, and I think domineering covers it rather nicely. I won't go too much further than that.
Yeah.
But shutting everyone else down.
Yeah.
Folks forget also the idea that women are to be in submission. The point of submission is you were to have self-control.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going back to Genesis with the curse. The curse on women is submit to your husbands. That is, you keep yourself under control.
Yeah.
So, again, that's the example of Jesus. Great power under control.
Well, and take that to an extreme, and what happens? Take that equation to an extreme, and what happens? You have abusive men who say, you're supposed to be under my authority. And they're physically abusive, they're verbally abusive, they're spiritually abusive to their spouses. That is not what these authority passages are. And that's why I talked about last week. The word submit, I think, is so unfortunate for this translation. A much more accurate term would be yield. Yield to your husbands. And Paul even makes the point when he's talking about sexually, he's saying, for the wife does not belong to herself but to her husband, and the husband doesn't belong to himself but to his wife. Well, what's he doing there? He's putting them on equal. That's right. It's a give and take. It's not that, women are supposed to submit and give whatever their husband wants, and, that's not his point.
It's also said that, the man is the head of the church, or the head of the household, like Christ is head of the church, and Christ sacrifices himself for his church. So the man's supposed to sacrifice himself for his family, for his wife.
That's right. It's more.
It's mutual.
That's exactly right.
One over the other.
Yeah, the whole headship thing, and we didn't spend a lot of time on that, but, since you brought it up, like the whole headship thing, I've heard this used so often to say he's pointing to the position of the woman who's supposed to be under the headship and the authority of her husband. Bull crap. I'm sorry. That's not, to not mince words, that's not the point. The point is what? It's the opposite. The point is he's pointing at the husband saying, you're in this headship position, and this is, you sacrifice unto death. You be humble. You be kind. You be gracious. It's not about, your wife is under your authority, and so the man is the decision. That's always driven me crazy too. The husband is the decision maker of the family, not my family. And I'm okay. And I'm not saying my wife makes all the decisions. We make decisions together. Yeah, we communicate. We have a joint bank account. We have our money. We don't have my money and her money. We have our money. Every decision is made as a team, equally. Not one of us pulls the rank card and says, well, I'm the head of the house, and so, when it comes to how we're going to treat our kids in this certain situation, ultimately it's my decision. That is not, I don't think it's godly, number one. And two, I don't think it's a biblical approach. I think you're exactly right. It's this idea of sacrificing, self-sacrificing, because you love your equal partner so much.
Well, Jimmy, I think there's I once did a study on Ephesians based off of that book, and I forget who wrote it now, but Love and Respect. And in there, it emphasizes that why was it said to the husband to love your wife, and why was the wife told to respect her husband? And talks a little bit, and I think that was a little controversial, I think, in the way it was written, if I remember correctly, but
Yeah, there's still a lot of...
Yeah, there's a lot of controversy, but it always makes me just think about, well, is it just pointing out where we have those problems?
Yeah. Yeah.
In the way we treat each other.
Yeah, I think the idea was right behind what he wrote, but then he gets into some really weird headship stuff where he talks about, like, ultimately the man is he rules the roost, and I'm like, you missed it.
Yeah, the overarching point of it I thought was good, as far as, like, it's pointed at where do we have problems? Like,
Yeah.
Men tend to have problems with showing love the way they're supposed to. Women sometimes have problems showing the respect, and it's a where are we having issues?
Yeah.
I think part of it is also a lot of stuff I've been reading and listening to psychologists. Men kind of need respect for validation.
And what we want, yeah, what we need, yeah.
And women need to be nurtured and loved. We need to know that they are respected and protected, that they're safe. And when you have that breakdown, then you have the issues that you have.
Yeah.
I think that's why it was written that way, because intrinsically that's kind of the dynamics between man and woman. Yeah. So
I think the big problem that people had with that book is he kind of I think goes to a really bizarre extreme where he's saying, like, if the man's not respected, no wonder he behaves the way he behaves. Well, no. Like, yeah, that's right. Of course, if he's not respected, he's gonna be degrading, and because you didn't respect him. No, he's being degrading and disrespectful because he's not holy, right? It's the whole age-old, well, I did this because, whatever. Like, we hear it with abusers, child abusers. I did this because I was lonely. I didn't get what I needed or whatever. And no, you did this because you're deranged. You're messed up. I think the idea was right. But I think he took it to a really bizarre...
Where the brain ends up was not necessarily in the right place.
Right. Yeah.
From a woman's point of view, when I tried to read that book, what he was saying about women and how they perceive love, I was like, this is so wrong. I wanted to throw the book across the room. I was like,
Yeah.
no, I don't feel unloved when he leaves the towel on the floor. I still know he loves me.
Yeah.
I think that it's really rude if he's doing that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I was like, if he doesn't get it, he doesn't get women, and he's trying to speak for us.
Yeah. That was a huge criticism, and I think fair criticism of the book too. But okay. Oh no, that's good. But I just wanted to kind of wrap that all up and say, I think it's so wrong to use this paragraph in chapter 14 to prove a point that women's roles are to be submissive to men, that they're not to talk, don't ask questions, don't talk in any capacity. It's not the point Paul's making. It's just not. What's that? I think he wrote it just fine. I think we've done. We're kings and queens at taking things out of context. And if you look, again, that's why in my Bible, like, it might be hard to see, but that's why I circled, and circled, and then underlined. And what I circled is tongue. In verse 27, I circled tongue. In verse 29, I circled prophets. And in 34, I circled women. Those are the three groups he's talking about: tongue speakers, prophets, and women. And then I underlined keep silent, be silent. Keep silent in verse 28, be silent in verse 29, or 30 rather, and then keep silent in verse 34. And then I went back and I looked. I'm like, am I missing something? No. In the Greek language, it is the exact same word that he uses for all three of those groups. His point is, dial it back, tone it down. This is not a directive to be audibly silent. This is a directive to watch your attitude towards your fellow brother and sister. So, right, exactly.
Well, and because, like we talked about, the whole premise of 1 Corinthians, like the whole problem throughout almost everything that he discusses is arrogance.
Yeah,
I mean, they were being
right.
arrogant toward God, they were being arrogant towards other people, they were being arrogant towards each other.
Yeah,
And I mean, like, they had divisions, they had people who were being brazen in the way they were committing immorality, they were just being arrogant about everything.
yeah, Corinth was a hot mess. I mean, it really was. Like I mentioned about the Lord's Supper, too. His point was, you know, you guys eat and drink, you get drunk, and you're just gorging on food. You eat all the food before anybody shows up. This doesn't even resemble the Lord's Supper. And then he asked the rhetorical question, don't you have homes to eat and drink in? If you're that hungry, eat in your home first, and then show up so that there's food for the working people who can't get here at the same time that you get here. Because this is supposed to be a unifying event over the death of Christ, right? This is the sacrifice of all time. And you guys are, you're eating the food where people can't participate if they try. And so, you know, again, you have to ask the question, is Paul's point stop having the Lord's Supper, just stop doing it? Or is it rework the way you do it and frame it in a way that's caring and nurturing for your fellow Christian? I would strongly argue that that's the point Paul's making in all of these situations. When you speak, whether it's in a tongue, whether it's based on your gender, or whether it's prophesying, whatever the context is that you're speaking, do it in a way that's courteous and respectful and gracious to your fellow brother and sister. That's the point Paul's making. Okay, chapter 15 in our 5 minutes we have left. It's okay. I knew that we wouldn't make it real far, but it's good to have these conversations. There are other sections will go really quickly. I'm not going to read the entire chapter 15. You can thank me later. It's 58 verses. It's a very long chapter. But Paul's dealing now with another issue in Corinth. Can you imagine? Can you imagine there's an issue in Corinth? Isn't that shocking? There's an issue of misunderstanding the resurrection. What happens when you die? Boy, isn't that important? Yeah, right? I know. This is such a problem today because I've seen officiants of funerals who give me headaches and nosebleeds because they will just march. They'll do one of two things. They'll march somebody right up into the pearly gates who never knew Christ nor had any interest in knowing Christ their entire lives. And then they're like, oh, but he was such a good person and he's in the loving arms of Jesus right now. And I'm like, are you sure about that? And then you have other people who they'll take certain circumstances surrounding somebody's death. Suicide is a huge one. And they'll just plunge them right next beside Satan. And godly people, by the way. Godly people who struggled, who had internal demons that we will never understand. And because that was their last act on earth, they will just absolutely embarrass the family, the living family, and they'll shame that person right into hell. And I think it's it's so classless and terrible and just awful and wrong. So, we need to think about what happens at death, at the resurrection, because that also affects the way that we live our life now. It affects the way that we treat each other now. What happens at death really does matter. And so I think that's why Paul pours so much ink on this particular issue, is because it matters that much. The way that we think about life and death and the resurrection really, really matters. I'm just going to skip to verse 3 here. Paul says, because I underline, I just butcher my Bible so that things jump off the page when I'm like skimming it. I have this underlined, this expression. Paul says, "For I delivered to you as of," and then I underlined, "first importance." If Paul says this is of first importance, when I delivered the message to you, this was of first importance. To me, that's important. That's getting underlined. "I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. That he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas," that is Peter, "and then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep." Why is that important? Why does Paul make that point? He appeared to 500 people, most of whom are still alive, though some of them have died. They've fallen asleep. Why is that important? Yeah, but why does he mention about the people who are still alive? Yeah, they're witnesses. You want to check what I'm telling you? Go talk to them. Do you think Paul knew these 500 people? Go talk to them, right? Interview them. I can point you to who these people are. Hear it from their mouth. So the first importance, what Paul delivered, was that Christ died for our sins. He died for us. It goes back to what you were saying. It's the ultimate sacrifice. He loved you that much that he died for you. That's the ultimate submission, right? He submitted not only to God the Father, but he really submitted to us. I mean, that's the relationship Christ has with us, that he submitted. He didn't puff himself up and be like, "Do you know who I am?" Did he ever say that to people? I don't see him doing that. "Do you know who I am? I'm somebody." Like you see some of these preachers literally standing on chairs, their faces just beat red, and they're like pounding the pulpit, the podium, demanding that people get in line. And I'm like, you're insane. You're nuts. And I wonder what it's like in your home for your wife and your kids if you're standing up and you're that red-faced and telling people, "You get in line because I'm somebody." That's insanity. Christ humbled himself. I delivered to you of first importance that Jesus Christ, he died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. That he was buried, that he also was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12, and then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time. Go talk to them. Then he appeared to James, verse 7, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. What's Paul referencing here? Yeah, the road to Damascus. Christ has already been taken up to heaven. And he appears to Paul. And Paul makes a point too, I didn't meet with the apostles. I had not even spoken to them. And this is the revelation that was given to me. And Paul writes what's so in line with what the 12 apostles taught and spoke about. And so Paul's making that point. Like, this came from Christ himself. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. I did not squander it. I didn't abuse it. I didn't lord myself over people. It wasn't in vain that he gave me grace. God gave me grace, and I put that into action. I treated other people with grace and with mercy, and I'm preaching to you because God gave me grace, and I was so undeserving.
What you just said, I think is why he's doing it this late in the letter.
Yeah.
He's chastised them all throughout the letter,
Yep.
and now he's bringing it back home, if you will.
Yes.
Because you're all forgiven your sins. And Jesus is the one that did it, and you're submitting to him.
That's right.
And I think that's the proper culmination.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's not an accident. It's not coincidence that Paul places this in the letter at this point. Yeah, not a coincidence. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I. Right? I worked harder than any of them, but it was not I. It was the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preach, and so you believe. Paul's point, going back to chapter 1, who cares who baptized you? Who cares who preached to you? Who cares who's standing up in front of you? Who cares who's trained or better trained or less trained? Who cares? The point is, all of us brought Christ and delivered it to you people because of his love for you. Not because it was our calling and I just love to preach and it's just the best thing in the world and God has blessed me so much and oh my goodness, like if you sow this love seed, look at the crop that God will grow for you and you'll just be blessed beyond measure, bless your little heart, right? Paul does not use that language. I delivered these things to you, but who cares if it was me? If it wasn't me, then it was going to be somebody else. We did this because of God's grace and his love for you. We're out of time. We're past time. We're going to stop there. Thank you all for your questions and comments, and we'll finish chapter 15 next week, and hopefully get into 16. Thanks.
What do you see?